What's a real-life story you've heard that still gives you chills to this day? Story 1. When I was in 11th grade, my mathematics teacher went off on a tangent about everything happening for a reason and why it is always important to be kind. At first, I was only half listening, but then things got interesting. When he was a senior in university, he decided that in his last days, he would go around to students sitting alone in the cafeteria and strike up a conversation. He approached a girl sitting alone and asked if he could have lunch with her. She seemed hesitant at first, but then agreed. They started talking and ended up having a long conversation. She eventually asked him, in a startled way, why he came and sat with her. He explained that it had become his goal to sit with people he did not know. She told him that this was not the first time someone had randomly asked her to have lunch with them. Apparently, when she was in high school, she was very shy and unpopular and usually spent her lunch breaks in the library. Towards the end of the year, a group of popular girls asked her to have lunch with them. She was shocked and said no at first, but they persisted, and she eventually agreed. They got into one of the girls' cars and drove off school property, heading to a restaurant. As they were driving down the road, dozens of police cars sped past them. She went to Columbine High School. It was April 20th, 1999. She escaped being in the library where the majority of the shootings took place because a group of girls decided to reach out to her. Story 2. This is a story about my father. One day when he was young, about 10 to 12 years old maybe, he was playing outside near a small river with a friend. He lived in southern Wisconsin, so it was probably freezing cold. While playing, they noticed something strange in the water. It was a capsized canoe with two men who were probably fishing, hanging on for dear life in the freezing water. He said they had already turned bluish and could barely talk. So, the two kids pulled the men out and essentially saved their lives. It became a big thing in their town, with a story about it in the local newspaper and everything. Everyone was happy. Fast forward about 5 years. My father was on his way to a concert in Chicago with one of his buddies, the same kid as before, in his new car. Of course, they were young and careless, and it was the 1970s, so nobody wore seatbelts. While driving past a bar where there was a big party going on, a mobile home came flying out of the parking lot into the street. The driver obviously did not look and was probably drunk. My father crashed his car head-on into this trailer and totaled it. The fact that they were not wearing seatbelts saved their lives. The bottom half of the car was crushed, but the crash propelled them forward and upward. Luckily, nothing happened to him or his friend, no injuries, just shock. As they got out of the car and tried to catch their breath, the propane tank on the trailer exploded, and the whole thing went up in flames. Stumbling out of the trailer came two men in flames, screaming and moaning, their skin bubbling, and they died right there on the spot in front of everyone. People from the bar had gathered around. It turned out these two men were the exact same fishermen he and his friend had saved 5 years earlier. This is all true, by the way. I did not believe him at first, but he showed me the newspaper articles, and his parents confirmed the story. Story 3, I forgot the title, but there is this creepy story about a man who stays at a hotel with one rule. He cannot look into the unmarked locked room on the way to his own room. He looks through the keyhole and sees a woman sitting in the corner. He thinks about knocking but decides to leave her alone. The next morning his curiosity gets to him again, and he looks through the keyhole. However, this time all he can see is a distinct red color. He assumes the woman knew he was spying on her and covered the keyhole with red cloth. Later, he goes to the receptionist and asks about the room. The receptionist explains, "A woman was murdered in that room, and many guests have reported seeing her ghost. She was white all over, except for her eyes. They were red." Story 4. My great-grandparents grew up in a small town located in the lower regions of Louisiana. Raised on a steady diet of squirrel stew and local folktales, my grandparents were the classic Cajun stereotype. When my great-grandparents were first married, they lived in a small house near a cane field. Across the field was a Catholic church that served most of the humble bayou town. My great-grandparents made it a habit to attend church during daylight hours since it was a long walk to and from church unless they cut through the cane. One night, for one reason or another, they decided to attend evening mass. They walked to church as the sun dipped below the horizon. When they exited the building, it was pitch dark. Exhausted from a long day of work, They decided to walk through the cane field to take the shorter path. The crickets chirped as they crunched their way through the cane, one following the other. They could barely see under the dim moonlight, relying only on sound and touch. Working their way through the cane was tiring, and my grandfather stopped to catch his breath. My grandmother bumped into him, and they both froze. Another set of footsteps had joined theirs. They stood still, hearing the heavy thud of feet crunching against the cane. My grandfather began to walk slowly, my grandmother by his side, afraid to anger whatever was following them. My grandmother noticed its odd walking pattern and immediately felt a rush of fear. She began to run, and the footsteps behind them quickened. My grandfather ran after her, not wanting to be caught by the stranger. After several minutes of sprinting, they reached the end of the field, their house in sight. They rushed to the door, fumbling with the key. A shadow emerged from the cane field, walking on four legs. It started running toward them just as they managed to unlock the door. As they opened it, their dog ran inside. Their dog, Kaiser, trembled as they locked the door. Kaiser was usually fearless and often accompanied my grandfather on his hunting trips. But his bravery was gone as the door began to shake. Something was banging and scratching on it. My grandfather assumed it was an animal. Then the doorknob began to turn, as if someone was trying to open it from the outside. Eventually it stopped. Shuffling could still be heard outside the door. My grandfather grabbed his rifle and stood guard all night while my grandmother slept. When the sun began to rise, the noises stopped. When they opened the door, it was covered in large scratch marks. Until her death, my grandmother claimed that she was chased by the Rougarou, the Cajun werewolf. Story 5. A 16-year-old girl was house-sitting for a family friend. Late one night, when she was all alone, she heard a strange noise coming from the basement. The noise would not stop, but since she was by herself, she decided not to go down as fear began to creep into her mind. She called emergency services and explained her situation, telling them not to rush since it was probably nothing. Within 2 minutes, several officers arrived at the door. 4 of them went down into the basement, while one stayed with the girl outside. She heard yelling, and moments later, a deranged-looking man was brought up by the police. He had been sitting on the washer, banging a machete between the washer and dryer, trying to lure her down. She asked how they knew he was down there, and they said that when she called and hung up the phone, the operator heard a second click. He had been listening. Story 6. When Chinese flag bearer and basketball star Yao Ming walked through the National Stadium during the opening ceremony of the Olympic Games, there was so much commotion where I was that I failed to notice who the little boy walking with him was. It turned out to be Lin Hao, a 9-year-old who survived the deadly earthquake in Sichuan in May. It is remarkable how this tribute to the earthquake by opening ceremony director Zhang Yimou was covered by the international press. Many Western outlets reported that Lin was an earthquake survivor, but they failed to mention that the boy, who attended Uzixi Primary School in Wenchuan County, the epicenter of the quake, not only survived, but after escaping his classroom, went back into the rubble to pull 2 classmates out to safety. During the rescue, he was hit by falling debris and suffered injuries to his head and arms. It was also reported that while his classmates, 10 survivors out of 32 students, were waiting for help, he encouraged them to sing songs to keep their spirits up. When asked why he risked his life, he said, "I was the hall monitor. It was my job to look after my classmates." Story 7. This will probably get buried, but another user mentioned Carla Homolka, and it reminded me of a story about my mother. In her early 20s, my mother managed a photography studio in a mall in Scarborough, Ontario. One day while working alone, a man came in asking for a photo but acted strangely, saying he needed a picture taken of his hip. They often did injury photos for court cases, so my mother assumed that was what he needed and began preparing the camera. When she looked up, the man had taken off his pants and was exposing himself. My mother started laughing hysterically and told him to get out, saying she did not have time for his nonsense. About an hour later, a girl who worked at the denim store down the hall came in to tell her about a man who had exposed himself in the store, trying to show off to female customers. They laughed about it, thinking he was just disturbed, but not dangerous. 2 days later, the same girl came running into my mother's studio, pale as a ghost. On the front page of the newspaper was a sketch of the man with the headline, Scarborough Rapist. It was shocking to realize that my mother had been that close to being attacked by Paul Bernardo at the height of his violent crime spree. Story 8. About 15 years ago, I was 17 and in high school in Seattle. I often hung out with people who smoked or drank, but rarely joined in myself. My parents made sure I understood that I did not need it. Still, I occasionally participated. One night, I was with a few friends from our soccer team. They wanted to smoke before heading home since it was a school night. We went to Volunteer Park on Capitol Hill, where the west side of the road has a lot of trees where people can do things they do not want to be seen doing. Everything was normal, just some laughing, excited teenagers smoking a bit of weed. No big deal. I took a hit off the blunt, but since my parents were picking me up, I decided to keep watch for police. I only wanted to try it once, go home, and play some video games, but still seem cool. I told them I would go check for cops. They might have noticed or not, it did not matter. The park has evergreen trees with low-hanging branches that make it easy to climb 20 feet or more. Imagine a really big Christmas tree, but with gaps that allow a clear view. I climbed one and relaxed, looking at the Space Needle. It was a beautiful night. Then I heard branches snapping below and saw a man standing there, staring toward where my friends were. I looked past him about 25 feet and saw another man, and a few more. To my other side, there were more men, about 15 in total, standing in a semicircle around where my friends were. It was around 11 at night, and there was no reason for a group like that to be there. I stayed completely still. They were not police or security. After what felt like forever, I quietly climbed down, dropped to the ground, and sprinted as fast as I could toward the greenhouse. About 50 feet away, I saw my friends running out of the woods from where they had been. They said someone had tried to grab one of them on the way out, and when she screamed, they all ran. No reason, no warning, just terrifying. I have heard of people disappearing from Seattle parks before. Be careful out there, especially if you are a high schooler just trying to have some fun. Story 9. When I was about 4 and my sister was almost 1, my parents had been divorced for a few months, and my mother was driving us from Las Vegas to Wichita to visit our grandparents. At one gas station along the way, a man came up to the car and told my mother, "I hate to see a single mother traveling alone, and I noticed we're headed in the same direction. Would you like me to follow you for a while to make sure you're safe?" She politely declined and drove off. At our next stop for gas, he showed up again, pretending to be checking on us. He had been following us since the last stop. While he was talking to my mother, his sport coat blew open, and I saw a gun tucked into his pants. After she once again told him we were fine, she left and I told her what I saw. While driving, she wrote a note to give to the next gas station attendant, describing who we were, where we planned to spend the night, and what the man looked like, asking them to call the police and have them waiting at the hotel. When we got to the next stop, Mom ran inside, handed the clerk the note, and sped off. When we arrived at the hotel, the manager had the officers waiting in one room and gave us another room with a pizza and soda. Later, the man showed up and asked if his wife and kids had checked in yet and what room they were in. The manager handed him the key to the room where the police were waiting. They questioned him and discovered he was a convicted offender with an outstanding warrant, so he was arrested on the spot. Story 10. I hope this doesn't get buried. My friend Jacob told me this about a month ago. For some background, Jacob's mother struggled with addiction, while his father was fairly stable aside from being with her. One night, when Jacob and his father were asleep, they shared a room. They heard loud banging, scratching, and moving noises coming from his mother's room. Jacob's father jumped out of bed, ran down the hall, and began pounding on her door. She opened it, yelling at him to quiet down because he had woken her up. He asked her about the noises, but she said she hadn't heard anything. He might have assumed she was under the influence again, but something felt off. The window in her room was wide open, and the television had been moved across the room, still plugged in, but facing outside. Jacob's father was understandably alarmed. He shut the window, grabbed a bat, locked her room from the outside, and made her sleep in the living room. He stayed awake most of the night. He woke Jacob at 5 in the morning when it was still dark. Jacob went into the kitchen where his mother was already sitting and started eating cereal. A few minutes later, his father walked in, wide-eyed, motioned for silence, and pointed upward. They heard something shuffling on the roof, moving from one edge to another. Jacob's father clutched the bat while they sat together in silence. After several tense minutes, the sound faded. Jacob's grandmother was called and asked if everyone could stay with her for a while. She agreed and said she would pick them up. Jacob finished eating and sat on the couch, in a room without a television, just waiting. Then he looked toward the open door of an empty room down the hallway and saw a finger wrapped around the edge of the door. Jacob screamed and pointed, and his father grabbed him and ran. His mother followed as they rushed out of the house, driving to a gas station where they waited until Jacob's grandmother arrived. Jacob told me the finger looked unnatural long, wide and oddly shaped, like a foam finger but made of flesh. It was wrapped completely around the door frame, even though the door was latched on the opposite side. After retrieving their belongings later, they never went back. Nothing was stolen, but the window in that empty room was open. Story 11. I work as a nurse. While I was training, some friends and I were discussing whether there is an afterlife. I said I didn't think so, but a few disagreed. My instructor looked at me and said, "I used to be like you, but I've seen strange things in hospitals that made me change my mind." She then told us about her friend, also a nurse, whose daughter had terminal cancer. The daughter was in her late 20s or early 30s, with a husband and 2 small children. She was nearing the end, fully aware that she was dying, and often told her family how afraid she was of death, especially of dying alone. Her parents took turns spending the night with her in her hospital room, along with her husband. One night, it was her father's turn to go home to care for the grandchildren. She passed away that same night, and her final words were, "I'm not afraid anymore. Dad is here with me." As many healthcare workers can confirm, patients often say strange final words that may or may not have meaning. After the body was processed and taken to the morgue, the mother went home and found her husband dead on the couch. She expected to plan 1 funeral, but now had to plan 2. It was chilling. Also, there is said to be a ghost in my hospital, a 10-year-old girl, the first child to die there. Many patients claim to see her in a white hospital gown, and several have shouted, "Get that little girl out of here." Story 12. I was 16 or 17, and it was common for my friends and me to go camping in the mountains with weed, beer, acid, whatever. I was always a big coward when it came to getting high, so I usually stayed sober. I guess my parents' warning stuck with me. That particular night, most of my friends were on acid, while I was just sipping a beer, enjoying the fire. A bunch of us girls decided to wander off somewhere to pee. We were still pretty young and squeamish about the boys seeing us squat. We stumbled into the woods and kept walking for a while because one girl, who was really high, insisted on finding the perfect spot. We finally came to a small clearing and decided to go there. Everyone finished, and we started heading back to camp. Then one of my friends said she heard a low moan coming from the other side of the clearing. She told us to be quiet, but none of us heard anything and just wanted to go. She was determined to check it out, and I decided to go with her. It was really dark. You could only see as far as the lantern's light reached, so we stepped into the unknown. Suddenly, our light revealed a car, a brand new looking Subaru. The sight startled us, and we bolted back to our friends, screaming like the 16 or 17-year-old girls we were, and hurried back to camp completely freaked out. When we told the boys, they laughed and said we had probably stumbled across another campsite. 5 years later, I was in nursing school, working as an administrative assistant in a labor and delivery hospital. I had made a close friend at work, and one night when she came over for drinks, she told me her father had been missing since she was in high school. She said he had tried to take his own life before, and her family assumed he had succeeded, though no one ever found him. She always secretly hoped he had just started a new life somewhere, and that she would see him again someday. Not long after that, news broke that a man had been found in a stolen Subaru up in the mountains where we used to camp. He had been there for years through every season, with a hose running from the tailpipe to the window. He had ended his life. It was all over the news, and one of my old high school friends called me, reminding me of that night in the woods. The car had been found near our usual campsite. It was the same one we had seen. At work, my friend got a call from her mother. The man in the car was her father. We had heard him moaning. We had seen the car. If we hadn't been such clueless kids, we could have done something. I watched my friend fall apart over it, but I never told her what I had seen that night. I still feel awful about it. Story 13. This is the story of how I came to believe in ghosts. When I was 12, my mother dragged me and my friend along while she got a haircut. We were bored, so we decided to take a walk down the main street and window shop. Just a few stores away, there was a small parking lot. As we walked past, an elderly African-American woman waved us over to her car. The door was open, and she looked frail, so we approached to see what was wrong. She seemed confused and begged us to go across the street to another salon her daughter owned, saying she was stuck in the car and needed her daughter's help. She kept repeating, "Please just get my daughter," and I'm stuck in the car, even as we walked away to do what she asked. We crossed the street and went into the salon, two pale little girls walking into a primarily African-American hair studio, and were met with puzzled looks. We were brought to the manager, who listened to our story and went pale almost instantly. Her expression changed from curious to terrified in seconds. She began asking us questions, visibly shaken. When we asked why, she explained that her mother had died a few months earlier in a car accident, forced off a bridge, trapped inside, and drowned. We ran back across the street. There was no car, no woman. We asked the lot attendant, but he said no one matching that description had been there all day. I'll never forget the look on that daughter's face. We thought it was a prank at first, but her reaction was too raw and real for that. Story 14. When I was a Boy Scout, I earned the filmmaking merit badge at winter camp one year. To get it, you had to make a short film no matter how terrible. Since we were all out in the woods, we decided a slasher movie would be fun. We wrote a script about a masked killer stalking people at a Boy Scout camp. There was a kid named Paul in our group who everyone liked. He was one of those naturally easygoing guys. But we unanimously voted to make him play the killer because he had this eerie, wide-eyed look that fit the part. He was perfect pretending to stab victims and being menacing enough for a bunch of 12 and 13-year-olds making a camp film. We edited it, full of fake blood and bad acting, and I forgot all about it. 6 years later, when I was a freshman in college, I spotted Paul walking between buildings. I ran up, said hello, and we chatted briefly about our upcoming spring break plans before parting ways. A week later, I was at home watching the news when I saw a story about a young man who had killed his parents and their 2 dogs before setting their house on fire. The police already had a suspect in custody. When his photo appeared on screen, it was Paul. He had stabbed them to death the same way he had done in our little horror film. Story 15. This isn't a story I heard, but one I experienced myself. I was 7 years old when my mother, my sister, and I moved into our new house in Florida. My father had died the year before from complications during a triple bypass surgery. My sister and I slept upstairs, and between our rooms was an open loft area. One night, I woke up very late and for some reason got out of bed and looked across the loft toward my sister's room. Clear as day, I saw the shadow of a man standing at the edge of the stairs. The house was pitch dark. There were no lights to cast shadows. Being 7, I panicked, thinking it was a burglar, jumped back into bed and cried myself to sleep. About 15 or 30 minutes later, I woke up again, checked the stairs, and the shadow was gone. I grabbed my small flashlight and went downstairs toward my mother's room. Her door was slightly open, so I peeked through and saw a shadowy figure walk around her bed, then lean over her. I shined my light on the floor in front of her door, and the figure instantly straightened up, seemed to look at me, then turned and walked into her bathroom. I'm an atheist, and I don't know if I believe in spirits, but to this day I have no explanation for what I saw, other than that it might have been my father checking up on us, bending over to kiss my mother goodbye one last time. Even now, just recalling it sends chills down my spine. Story 16. This may get buried, but for those who read new posts, a friend of mine lived on Long Island around 2001, I think in Brentwood. I lived in California back then, and still do. I only knew one woman who died on September 11th, a flight attendant on the plane that crashed in Pennsylvania, and even then, I barely knew her. I figured my friend, being closer to New York, probably knew more people or at least had a personal story about that day. I asked her out of a kind of morbid curiosity. September 11th always felt like a movie to me, something that happened on television, not in real life. I thought she might tell me about collapsing buildings or running crowds so I could say, "That sounds horrible," while secretly thinking it must have been unreal to witness. But her story wasn't exciting at all. It was hauntingly simple. She said she hadn't been in Manhattan and didn't personally know anyone who died, but every morning before work she arrived at the train station very early, earlier than most commuters. Before September 11th, the parking lot was nearly empty when she got there. Afterward, there were always 6 or 7 cars sitting there, the same ones every day. They never moved. Each day, they collected more tickets and chalk marks until the parking attendants finally identified their owners and realized they were never coming back. That quiet image the cars left behind, their owners gone, hit me harder than any footage of the towers or the news reports. It made everything feel real for the first time. Story 17. Once upon a time, there was a man made entirely of pillows. His body was a pillow, his head was a pillow, his fingers and toes were pillows, and he stood about 9 feet tall. The Pillow Man had a very sad job. He possessed magical powers that allowed him to travel through time, and his task was to visit children who would grow up to live miserable lives. He would try to convince them to take their own lives while they were still innocent, sparing them the suffering he knew awaited them in the future. One day, the Pillow Man visited a little girl who was destined for great pain. He told her all the terrible things that would happen to her, but she didn't believe him. She said, "I'm happy, Mr. Pillowman. I've always been happy, and I'll always be happy." The Pillow Man looked at her and couldn't bring himself to convince such a cheerful child to die. Years later, he returned to her as an adult. She asked him, "Why didn't you convince me, Mr. Pillowman? Why did you let me live this horrible life?" He replied, "You were such a happy little girl." She said, "But Mr. Pillowman, I've never been happy," and then took her own life. The Pillowman was heartbroken. His job was unbearable. If he succeeded, a child would die young. But if he failed, that child would live a life of misery. One day he decided to take on one final task. He traveled back in time and found a little boy sitting behind a tree. "I want to talk to you, little boy," he called out. The child stepped out, but it wasn't just any boy. It was the Pillow Man himself as a child. The Pillow Man told the Pillow Boy about the horrible things he would grow up to do and the terrible burden he would carry. The boy understood immediately. He took a can of gasoline, poured it over himself, and said, "Will you tell my mommy I won't be home for dinner?" The Pillow Man said yes, though he was lying. The Pillow Boy struck a match and went up in flames. As he burned, the Pillow Man began to fade away, and the last thing he heard were the cries of all the children who would now live their tragic lives without his intervention. The Pillow Man by Martin McDonough. Story 18. 2 years ago, in 6 days, I was in a car wreck that nearly killed me. I was driving home late at night, fell asleep at the wheel, and slammed into a tree on the driver's side front door. I have no memory of what happened for the next few days, but I woke up in the intensive care unit, strapped to a bed with a respirator and feeding tube in me. I had broken bones in my skull and collarbone, collapsed both lungs, and ruptured my diaphragm. Every doctor I have seen since has looked at me in disbelief, telling me I shouldn't be alive. The chilling part is how I was found. Some neighbors were driving home late after dropping their daughter off at a bus that was taking her to camp, where she was a counselor. The bus had left late because a couple of other counselors were an hour and a half behind schedule. One of them was my best friend from elementary school. After finally dropping their daughter off, they headed home down a secluded road near our neighborhood. The wife noticed a car parked on the wrong side of the road, but she couldn't see any damage because it was dark and on the opposite side. They kept driving until she thought she heard honking and convinced her husband to turn around. I was unconscious. The car's horn wasn't functioning, but somehow they had heard something. They didn't know it was me until 2 days later. They saved my life. Story 19. My favorite creepy story, quite long but worth it. In 1983, a group of deeply religious scientists conducted a radical experiment in an undisclosed facility. They theorized that if a human were stripped of all sensory input, they might become capable of perceiving the presence of God. The scientists believed that the five senses clouded human awareness of eternity and that without them, a person might establish contact with the divine through thought alone. An elderly man who said he had nothing left to live for volunteered to be the subject. To remove his senses, the scientists performed an intricate surgery, severing every sensory nerve connection to his brain. Although he retained full muscular control, he could no longer see, hear, taste, smell, or feel. He was left entirely alone with his thoughts. The scientists monitored him as he spoke aloud about his state of mind, in jumbled, slurred words he couldn't even hear. After 4 days, he claimed to be hearing faint, unintelligible voices in his head. Assuming it was early psychosis, the scientists ignored his pleas. 2 days later, he said he could hear his deceased wife's voice, and even more, he could respond to her. The scientists were intrigued but skeptical until the man began identifying the dead relatives of the scientists themselves. He repeated personal details that only their departed spouses or parents could have known. Horrified, many of the team abandoned the project. After a week of what he called conversation with the dead, the subject became distraught, saying the voices had become too many and too loud. Every waking moment, hundreds of voices filled his mind, refusing to let him rest. Desperate for relief, he threw himself against the walls, trying to feel pain, and begged for sedatives so he could sleep. The sedatives worked for 3 days until the nightmares began. He said that in his dreams, he could see and hear the dead vividly. A day later, he began screaming and clawing at his useless eyes, begging to sense something physical again. He said the voices were no longer gentle. They were furious, speaking of hell and the end of all things. For 5 hours, he screamed, "No heaven, no forgiveness," and begged to die, but the remaining scientists insisted he was on the verge of contacting God. After another day, he could no longer form coherent sentences. In his madness, he bit chunks of flesh from his arms, forcing the scientists to restrain him. Several hours later, he suddenly stopped struggling and stared blankly upward, silent tears streaming down his face. For 2 weeks, he had to be rehydrated manually because he would not stop crying. Then one day, without warning, he turned his head, locked eyes with a scientist, despite his blindness, and whispered, "I have spoken with God, and he has abandoned us." Moments later, his vital signs flatlined. There was no apparent cause of death. Story 20. This happened several years ago when I was 19. It was sometime during the summer, probably in June. I was staying with my best friend, who lived with her grandparents, and around 11 at night, we decided to drive down to see some friends in Tulsa, about 4 hours away from Kansas City. Never mind that we would arrive around 3 in the morning. It was the weekend, so our friends would probably still be up partying. We grabbed some snacks and hit the road. We had driven to Tulsa many times, but the only route we knew was Route 69, a narrow 2-lane highway cutting through the middle of nowhere. We would have preferred the interstate since it was nighttime, but her grandparents didn't have internet access. We couldn't find a map, and this was before the days of GPS. So, Route 69 it was. The drive between Kansas City and Tulsa was nothing but darkness, cornfields, dense woods, and no streetlights. There was no cell service anywhere along that stretch, so we were relying entirely on luck that nothing would go wrong. We had no idea how bad the night could get. Everything started out fine. We were blasting music, eating snacks, and cruising with the windows down. About 2 hours in, deep in the middle of nowhere, we reached the point of no return. We had just enough gas to either make it to Tulsa or go back home, and the road on both sides had become thick with trees. Then things started to get strange. We noticed blood on the other lane of the road. At first, we thought someone had hit a deer. It happens all the time out there. But as we kept driving, the blood didn't stop. It got worse, more and more of it, until eventually there was a massive pool stretching across several car lengths, splattered into the woods. That's when we realized something was very wrong. It was far too much blood for a deer. There were no animal remains, no fur, no broken glass, no car parts, nothing but blood. The amount was horrifying and it looked fresh. We hadn't passed a single car in miles, and if someone had hit an animal and kept driving, they would have passed us by then. It was as if whatever happened had just occurred within the last hour or two at most. We both got an uneasy feeling in our stomachs. It wasn't just the blood, it was something in the air, that deep instinct telling you to get out. We tried to decide whether to turn around or keep going, but before we could, the choice was made for us. Suddenly, I had to slam on the brakes. There was a roadblock right in front of us. It looked all wrong. There had been no warning signs leading up to it, and the barricades were old and decayed, the kind with orange and white stripes. But the paint was peeling, and the wood was rotted. The words "road closed" were barely visible. There was no sign of construction, no flashing lights, and no workers, just silence. Then off to the right, we saw something even more disturbing. A small, crooked sign nailed to a post. It said "Detour," misspelled, painted in dripping red letters. It pointed down a narrow dirt path leading straight into the pitch-black woods. The road was overgrown, almost swallowed by weeds, and it veered away from the direction of the highway. We didn't even have to discuss it. We were getting the hell out of there. For some reason, though, we decided to switch drivers before leaving. We both got out of the car, running around to trade seats, and just as we got back inside with the windows still rolled down, we heard movement. Voices, low, muffled, coming from both sides of the road, just beyond the tree line. My friend floored it. We sped off as fast as my old car could go, not daring to look behind us. We didn't stop until we saw the glow of city lights again. To this day, we have no idea what happened on that road. When we got back to her grandparents' house, we snuck inside and didn't speak about it for days. I still get chills thinking about it, those voices, that blood, and that sign. Whatever was waiting down that dirt path, we came far too close to finding out. Story 21. I've been lying here for hours. It's 5:35 in the morning, and there's nothing I can do. You know what the worst part is? I'm in the same room as my parents. They keep looking at me, and I'm trying not to cry or scream. Their eyes are wide open, staring straight at me, and their mouths are hanging open too. The smell of blood is so strong I can taste it. I can't move. I can't even breathe without shaking. The thing is, if I make even the slightest sign that I'm awake, I'm dead. There's no one here who can save me. I've tried thinking of a way out, but the only plan I have is to bolt for the door, run outside, and scream for help, hoping the neighbors hear me. It's risky, but staying here means I'll die. He's waiting for me to wake up and see what he's done. You're probably wondering what's going on. Let me explain. About 3 hours ago, I heard screaming from the other side of the house. I got up to check, but I had to use the bathroom first. I know it was stupid. I could have been killed. But I went anyway, did my business, and peeked out the door. There was blood on the carpet. I froze. Then I ran back to my room and hid under my blanket, convincing myself it was just a dream. But then I heard the bathroom door open. My heart stopped. I peeked out from under the blanket and saw something dragging my parents into my room. It wasn't human. It was hairless, eyeless, naked walking, hunched over like a caveman. But it knew exactly what it was doing. It propped my dad against the edge of my bed, facing me. Then it sat my mom in the chair and turned her toward me too. After that, it smeared its bloody hands across the wall, drawing a circle with a pentagram inside it. When it was finished, it crawled under my bed and waited. My eyes have adjusted to the dark now, and I can finally see what it wrote on the wall. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. In huge, shaky letters, it says, "I know you're awake." Story 22. This is a true story. I witnessed it myself, and I'm probably one of the most skeptical, logic-driven people you'll ever meet. My mother always believed her dreams had meanings. She's about 62 now and grew up in Syria, a place full of old myths and superstitions. I never took her seriously. I always told her, for every dream that comes true, there are hundreds that don't. People just remember the ones that do. Anyway, when I was about 15, one morning just before noon, my mother came into the kitchen visibly shaken and started crying. We all asked what was wrong. She said she had a terrible dream about her elderly mother, who still lived in Syria while we lived in Australia. My mother had never cried over a dream before, so we were surprised. She told us she dreamed her mother was holding her head in her hands as if she were in pain. That was all simple but unsettling. We tried to comfort her, laughing it off, saying we'd call Grandma later just to check in. When we called that afternoon, my uncle answered. He said Grandma was fine, but she had tripped that morning and bumped her face on a cupboard. She was bruised but otherwise okay. My mother was relieved for a moment, chatted with her mom, told her she loved her, and hung up. But then she started crying again, harder this time. She said she still felt something was wrong. We kept reassuring her, saying she had just spoken to her mom and everything was fine. She stayed quiet, alone in her room, weeping. Hours later, the phone rang. My father answered. It was my uncle. Grandma had just passed away from a stroke literally minutes earlier. We all went to my mother's room. She looked up at us through tears, nodded slowly, and said she already knew. We all hugged her. I would never have believed any of it if I hadn't seen it happen with my own eyes. Story 23. I remember a story about a girl whose family had just moved to a new neighborhood. She was 17 at the time. Shy, quiet, and gentle, struggling to make friends at her new school. One day, a boy she liked invited her to a party at his house while his parents were away. She was thrilled, finally feeling included in something social. She told her parents she was having a sleepover with her friend Alexis, a lie, of course. Her parents, being very religious, agreed as long as it was a clean night with no alcohol or drugs, and that she came home the next day. When she arrived at the boys' house that Friday night, some friends were already there, smoking weed and taking shots. They urged her to join, and after just a few drinks, she was tipsy. The boy's older brother, who was 22, said he needed to make a beer run, and she decided to ride along. That was her mistake. They blasted loud music and drove recklessly down the main road. She was scared but too polite to say anything. Then in an instant, the car swerved into the opposite lane and hit another vehicle head-on. The crash killed everyone in the front seats and both people in the other car. She and another girl were critically injured. At the hospital, the girl knew she wouldn't make it. She asked the doctor to tell her parents that she was sorry for disobeying them and that she loved them very much. The doctor nodded and smiled gently. Later that night, she passed away quietly. The next morning, a nurse asked the doctor if he had told the parents what their daughter had said before she died. The doctor replied softly, "No." The nurse was furious and said, "If you don't tell them, I will." The doctor shook his head. "You can't," he said. "They died on impact." Story 24. An Appalachian Mountain Club crew member named George was sent up one spring to check the winter damage at the Lakes of the Clouds hut on Mount Washington. He carried a two-way radio to report back to the base about any repairs or equipment needed to reopen the site. The windows of the hut had been boarded up tightly against the fierce winter winds, and that's exactly how George found them when he arrived. By afternoon, the base crew radioed him to confirm he had reached the hut safely. There was no response. They weren't worried at first. Maybe he had gone exploring, but when night came and still no word, concern set in. By 8 that evening, the crew decided that if they didn't hear from him by morning, they would head up the mountain. The next day, they hiked the snow-packed trail to the hut. George's gear was inside, spread out on the dining room floor. His two-way radio was on the table, still powered. They called for him, but heard nothing. Searching every room, they found the hut silent and dark, the windows sealed. Then someone heard a sound, a whimper, from under the kitchen sink. They opened the cabinet doors and found George crouched inside, trembling violently, his hands white-knuckled around an axe. "Please," he begged, "just get me the hell out of here." His clothes were soaked with sweat, his face pale with terror. They asked what had happened, but he only repeated, "Just get me out of here." They led him down the mountain, radioing for an ambulance to meet them at the base. He was hospitalized for weeks, too frightened to speak of what he saw. Eventually, he told one trusted friend the story. After arriving, he had gone inside to rest and take stock of his supplies before calling the base. He was sitting in the large dining hall when he suddenly felt a presence behind him, someone standing close enough to touch his shoulders. He spun around, but the room was empty. Then out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. In one of the windows, completely boarded up from the outside, was a face, a distorted, twisted face pressed against the glass. George froze. Then he looked to another window, and another, and another. Every single pane showed the same horrifying face, staring back at him from behind the boards. As he watched, the faces seemed to melt through the glass and drift toward him. That was the last thing he remembered. George never returned to the mountain again, and even after years, he refused to speak of what happened inside that hut. Story 25. 7 or 8 years ago, during a stretch of hot, dry August days, I went to a bluegrass festival at Thomas Point Beach in Brunswick, Maine. The headliner that year was Ralph Stanley, the legendary musician who'd been performing since the late 1940s and had recently gained new fame because his haunting song, "Oh Death," had been featured in the "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou" soundtrack. On the day of his performance, I was standing near the front left of the stage. Ralph was dressed head to toe in black cowboy hat, shirt, boots, and I remember thinking he must have been sweltering in the summer heat. The show started off as a typical, solid set, but after just 3 songs, the rest of the band stopped playing. Ralph stepped forward, took the microphone in his trembling hands, and began singing "Oh Death" in that quavery, chilling voice of his. A few lines in, I noticed people around me turning away from the stage. When I turned my head, I realized that just a few feet away, the crowd had parted around a heavy-set woman lying flat on her back. Someone was performing CPR on her. Ralph Stanley, likely unable to see what was happening through the stage lights, though it was no more than 30 feet away, just kept singing, "You run my life right out of my soul. Oh, death, please consider my age. Please don't take me at this stage." A woman beside me, eyes fixed on the scene, whispered, "Do you hear this song? Is this really happening right now?" By the time Ralph finished the song, the man performing CPR had stopped. The woman was gone. She had suffered a heart attack. The crowd fell silent, and in that heavy stillness, you could hear the faint wail of an approaching ambulance. Later that night, my friend talked to the fiddle player from Ralph's band while getting an autograph. The musician invited him to come hang out with the band on their bus. During a whiskey break, my friend brought up what had happened earlier, saying something like, "That must have been traumatic, huh?" The fiddle player just laughed, took a shot, and said, "Shit, that's happened like 4 times." Story 26. This actually happened to me. I live in Chicago, and a few years back, I was renting a big garden apartment with my girlfriend. We got the place specifically because it allowed pets, but that's beside the point. The apartment had a huge living room and kitchen, and in the kitchen there was a back door leading into the rest of the basement. Down there were concrete floors, stairs to the backyard, a washer and dryer, and a hallway leading to the storage area. The light for the laundry room was motion activated, but it always took a second or two to turn on. The walls were all made of cinder block, and on the far side of the basement, there was this odd room that clearly hadn't been part of the original structure. It stuck out from the wall about 10 feet. The door to it had 4 separate locks, a combination lock, a standard doorknob lock, a heavy padlock, and metal bars you had to push down. I never thought much of it until one night. I went downstairs, and before the motion light turned on, I saw a faint glow of light coming from under that door. When the basement light flicked on, it disappeared. That's when I realized the door opened outward. The locks were there to keep something inside, not out. I wanted to see if the light under the door was always on, so I left the basement, let the lights turn off, and peeked around the corner. The glow was still there. It made me uneasy, but I didn't investigate. I just tried to ignore it. Then a few weeks later, I noticed a small hole in the east wall of that strange room. Through it, I could see a faint light flickering inside. I was too afraid to look in for weeks. Finally, a couple of nights before we were set to move out, a few friends and I got drunk and decided to check it out. I stacked a few crates and peered through the hole. The room was small and mostly empty, a table with some scattered items, a small cot, a single chair. There was a picture on the wall, but I couldn't see it clearly from that angle. Sitting in the chair facing away from me was a person. They had long dark hair, though not black, and I couldn't tell whether it was a man or a woman. They didn't move, even though I must have made noise climbing onto the crates. I felt my blood run cold. Nothing about the scene was overtly threatening, but something deep inside me screamed that it was wrong. I nearly fainted from fear. My friends saw my face and didn't even bother looking. We just bolted upstairs, locked the doors, and sat in silence the rest of the night. We moved out soon after. The building is still there, but I'll never go back. Story 27. The neighborhood I grew up in was on the outskirts of Oklahoma City. My grandparents had built our house there, and it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. We rode our bikes freely, and the neighbors always looked out for one another. Just 3 doors down from us stood a place we all called the murder house. Before I was born, a man who lived there had been brutally murdered, and his girlfriend was horrifically assaulted. The murder weapon, a machete from a nearby greenhouse, was found in the backyard of our neighbors across the street. Everyone assumed it was a drug deal gone wrong. The case went cold and the house sat abandoned for years. When I was little, my bedroom faced the street, and from the ages of 4 to 11, I often woke up in the middle of the night after terrifying dreams. I always felt like someone was watching me. I didn't understand it at the time, but one day my parents quietly installed blackout shutters in my room. I never questioned why. We moved away when I was 11. Not long after, someone bought and renovated the murder house, and the tragedy faded into local memory. Fast forward 15 years, I was 26, lying in bed one night watching cold case files on A&E. Halfway through an episode, I noticed something familiar. Then the water tower of my old hometown flashed on the screen, followed by a photo of that house. The narrator began describing the murder that had taken place there. The case had finally been solved. The killer wasn't a drug dealer. It was a peeping Tom who had terrorized our neighborhood for nearly 2 decades. On the night of the murder, he'd been spying through windows when he saw the man's girlfriend and decided to attack her. Her boyfriend rushed to defend her and was slaughtered. The man escaped and continued stalking houses, watching families for years, including mine. My parents had installed the blackout shutters so he couldn't see into my room. He was finally caught after a woman, just 3 blocks from our old home, filed a complaint about a peeping Tom. Investigators found a bare footprint in her garden that matched one from the original crime scene. The man never wore shoes. I still get chills thinking about all those nights I woke up feeling eyes on me and realizing it wasn't just my imagination. Story 28. About 5 years ago, I was at a friend's house after his hot water tank had broken. A few of us had come by to help fix it. His dad had built the house himself a few years earlier. Everything was new, everything installed by family. While removing some wood near their wood-burning stove, we noticed a crack in the cement wall. Once the water heater was fixed, his dad promised to buy us dinner if we helped repair the wall. As we pried out a loose piece of cement, one of my friends spotted something wedged inside an old locked wooden box. We called his parents down since we had no idea what it was. They didn't either. The box looked ancient, covered in dust, with a rough carving on the front that read, "I will be back 3/23/14." Everyone froze. My friend was an only child, and that part of the wall had been built during construction. No one should have been able to put anything there. His dad set the box aside while we finished fixing the wall. Later that night, curiosity got the better of him. He brought out some tools and started trying to open it. After 20 minutes of prying and hammering, he broke the lock. Inside was only a single folded note. On it, scribbled in shaky handwriting, were the words, "Why did you open this without me?" His dad immediately called every family member who had helped build the house. But no one knew anything about the box. To this day, no one has claimed responsibility for it. Needless to say, everyone who was there that day agreed we'd all return to that house on March 23rd to see if whoever or whatever comes back. Story 29. When I was 11, I lived in Virginia with my mom, my brother, and my alcoholic stepdad, who was not a good man. One night, July 4th, or maybe the 5th, since it was after midnight, we were at my stepdad's boss's house for a party. My stepdad was flirting with his boss's wife, not very discreetly, and my mom noticed. Feeling hurt and ignored, she started drinking heavily. Malibu rum and cola after Malibu rum and cola. When we finally left, everyone except my brother and me was drunk. My brother was 13, and one of my stepdad's creepy neighbors had tagged along for the ride. We were driving through the middle of nowhere when Mom and my stepdad started screaming at each other. She began grabbing the truck controls and he slammed on the brakes, pulled over, and made her sit in the back with us. I'll never forget the look in her eyes, bloodshot, furious, desperate. She clenched her jaw and said, "You let me out of this truck right now." I opened the door. She bolted out and hid behind a bush. My brother and I followed her as my stepdad drove off and left us. It was near a closed gas station, and I pounded on the doors, crying and begging for help. Nobody answered. Mom said we had to walk back to the boss's house because it was closer than home. We were all barefoot except for me, and I gave my brother my flip-flops so he could run ahead to find help. Mom kept stumbling into the road every time headlights approached. She wanted to die. I was sobbing, trying to pull her back, but she was stronger than me. I shut my eyes and prayed silently. God, I can't hold her. She's going to die. Please help me. When I opened my eyes, there was a dog standing in front of us. It had a collar and seemed calm, even friendly. Mom, suddenly calmer, said, "We need to stay out of the road so the dog doesn't get hit." She took its collar, and we walked along the shoulder with it beside us. A few minutes later, my brother returned in the back of a police car. He had found people who called for help. It wasn't a happy ending, but my mom was alive, and that was enough. Sometimes I still think about that dog that appeared out of nowhere the moment I prayed. Story 30. This happened to me a few years ago, and I still get chills thinking about it. I was driving through West Texas on my way to California and decided to take a detour on Route 41 to visit a friend who was studying bats at Devil's Sinkhole. I stopped at the only gas station for miles to fill up, use the bathroom, and grab a snack. It was one of those ancient 70s-style stations with faded signs and old pumps you had to prepay inside for. When I walked in, the air was stifling hot, no air conditioning, and the shelves were covered in dust. Every bag of chips and candy bar was expired by at least 2 years. Even the refrigerators that should have been humming were silent. As I glanced out the front window, I saw one of the 2 employees circling my car. He ran his fingers along the trunk, then tugged at the driver's side door handle. My stomach dropped. I turned to the man behind the counter and said, "He's trying to get into my car." The cashier looked outside, then back at me with this blank, flat stare. "I don't see him doing anything," he said, monotone. Then, without breaking eye contact, he bent down just enough for me to see his arm reach under the counter for something. That's when instinct took over. I spun around, shoved the door open, and screamed at the man outside to back away or I'd smash his face in. Somehow my hands worked fast enough to unlock the door, jump in, and start the engine before the cashier could get out from behind the counter. I saw the door push open behind me as I peeled out of the lot. My heart was hammering so hard I could barely breathe. I floored it for nearly 50 miles before I realized I couldn't even remember what I'd seen in the rearview mirror. Just a blur, my head spinning from fear and adrenaline. When I finally called the police 20 minutes later, they told me that since nothing had actually happened, they weren't going to waste gas driving out there. To this day, I can still picture that man's empty stare while his hand slowly reached under the counter, and it still makes my blood run cold. Story 31. My dad has been a night shift cab driver in one of the roughest parts of the northwest of England for over 20 years. Before that, during the 70s and 80s, he served as a policeman in inner-city Liverpool, so he's not easily rattled. But one story he told me still gives me chills. Around 2 in the morning, he got a call to pick up 2 men from an old estate of Victorian terrace houses. It was a freezing December night, and the office warned them the wait would be at least 20 minutes. Yet the caller kept ringing, asking where their cab was. When my dad finally pulled up, the 2 men were already outside wearing nothing but t-shirts, shivering and visibly shaken. They jumped in the car, gave an address, and sat in silence, staring out the windows. After a few minutes trying to ease the tension, my dad joked, "You all right, lads? You look like you've seen a ghost." The reaction was instant. They looked at him, eyes wide, stunned that he'd said that. Then one of them began to explain. The guy who had made the call had just moved into that terrace a week earlier. His friend had joined him after their work Christmas party. They stopped for kebabs on the way home and decided to crash at the new house for a few more drinks. As they sat on the couch eating, the TV in the corner flickered, and one of them caught sight of something in the reflection, something behind the TV. There, standing in the corner, was a woman in a long white nightgown with tangled hair, staring directly at them. The man turned to his friend and said, "Who the fuck's that?" His friend looked up, froze, and replied, "Fucked if I know." In an instant, they both threw their kebabs in the air and bolted out of the house, running into the freezing street without their coats or shoes. That's where they'd been waiting, too terrified to go back inside. My dad said they didn't look like drunks or liars, Just two grown men who'd seen something they couldn't explain.